In the autumn of 1996, Mark Henderson, a 22-year-old university student, and his girlfriend, 20-year-old Emily Richards, set off on what should have been a peaceful weekend hike in the vast, untouched forests of Wisconsin. The Chechu-Nicolet National Forest, sprawling across nearly 600,000 hectares of wild terrain, seemed the perfect escape from the bustle of Chicago. But as Sunday evening came and went without a word from them, their families began to worry. By Monday morning, the situation had turned grave. Their car remained parked at the trailhead, untouched. No one had seen or heard from them. A massive search was launched, involving police, park rangers, and volunteers familiar with the area. For days they combed the thick woods, but found no sign of the missing couple. Then, on the third day, searchers stumbled upon their camp. The tent was not just. As the days passed, the search for Mark and Emily grew increasingly desperate. The dense, isolated terrain of Chechu-Nicolet National Forest offered no mercy to the search parties. Teams of volunteers, park rangers, and even helicopter crews scoured the miles of thick woodland, calling their names into the silence, but all they heard in return was the whisper of the wind rustling through the trees. Despite the large-scale efforts, no one could find a trace of the young couple. On the third day, hope seemed to falter. It was then, after hours of combing through the woods, that one group stumbled upon something unsettling. Deep within a small clearing, hidden away from the main trail, they found a scene so peculiar it sent chills down their spines. Mark and Emily's campsite was still standing, untouched, like a snapshot frozen in time. But there was one glaring issue: the couple was nowhere to be found. The first thing that caught the eyes of the searchers was the tent. Instead of being zipped shut, as one would expect from a camp set up in the wilderness, the entrance was cut open with a clean, deliberate slice from top to bottom. This wasn't the result of an animal attack. No claw marks, no rips or tears, as one might expect from a bear or any other wild creature. It was as though someone had taken a knife to it, making a precise incision with no signs of a struggle. The neatness of the cut only raised further questions, a sense of unease creeping into the minds of those who stood there. Inside the tent, everything seemed almost too perfect, too undisturbed. Both sleeping bags lay neatly spread out, almost as if they had been made up just moments before. Their backpacks rested nearby, unopened, with all their belongings intact. There were no signs of panic or haste. Their items, spare clothes, a first aid kit, maps and compasses, were all accounted for. Even Emily's camera, a precious piece of equipment for a pair of adventurers eager to document their journey, was present. The last pictures taken were of the camp itself, smiling faces, breathtaking forest landscapes, a peaceful, serene moment captured forever. The images didn't hint at the horror that would soon unfold. But the most unsettling detail was something far simpler: food. Their supplies, which should have been depleted, or at least disturbed, remained untouched. Mark and Emily had brought with them enough for the 2-day hike. Canned food, freeze-dried meals, energy bars, all were stored in a bag, suspended from a tree to avoid attracting wild animals. Yet, despite being in the heart of the forest, the bag remained exactly where it had been placed, unopened. There were no signs of scavenging, no half-eaten food, not even a trace of wild animal activity. It was as if no living creature had gone near the camp, which made the absence of the two hikers all the more strange. As the searchers stepped closer to the camp, trying to make sense of this eerie scene, they couldn't help but notice how odd everything was. There were no footprints around the tent, no marks in the earth to suggest that anyone had ventured off into the woods. The ground was as pristine as it had been when the camp was first set up. The idea that Mark and Emily had wandered off without taking any of their essential supplies seemed absurd. If they had gotten lost, they would have taken food or at least some equipment with them. If they had been attacked, their camp would have been ransacked, with signs of struggle or chaos. But none of that was present. Nothing about the scene added up. No signs of a struggle, no signs of panic, and most disturbingly, no sign of the couple. The only thing that remained was a perfectly preserved campsite, an unsettling void where 2 young lives had once been. The lack of blood, the absence of footprints, and the fact that everything was left as it was only deepened the mystery. It was as though Mark and Emily had simply vanished, leaving behind only their belongings, as if they had walked into thin air. The sheriff and his team were at a loss. Their initial theory that the couple had run off to start a new life seemed utterly implausible. Why would they leave everything behind, including money, documents, and all their personal items? And if they had been planning to run away, why would they have chosen such an isolated location in the middle of a vast forest? It didn't make sense. The investigation grew more confusing with each passing day. The forest seemed to swallow every clue, every lead, leaving the authorities and volunteers frustrated and disoriented. The mystery deepened as no further evidence surfaced, and the search efforts slowly dwindled. Days turned to weeks, and still no one had any answers. But then, as if the forest itself had grown tired of keeping it secret, something unexpected happened. Mark and Emily's disappearance, though haunting, faded into the background. The case went cold. For 5 long years there was no movement, no answers, no closure. The forest stood silent, keeping its secrets, hiding whatever had happened to the 2 young hikers. And then, in the spring of 2001, nature itself seemed to intervene. The severe winter was followed by an unusually warm spring, and torrential rains caused the rivers to burst their banks, flooding vast sections of the forest. As the waters receded, revealing a landscape reshaped by the flood, 2 forest rangers making their rounds would make a discovery that would both shock and baffle them, leading to the eerie unraveling of this dark mystery. The search for Mark and Emily became a frantic effort, but despite the best attempts of local authorities and volunteers, nothing could explain their sudden and inexplicable disappearance. The vast expanse of the Chechu-Nicolet National Forest, with its dense trees and winding trails, quickly became an unforgiving battleground for the search teams. The first few days of the operation were intense, with dozens of people involved, including local police officers, national park rangers, and a handful of volunteers from the nearby community who knew the terrain well. The teams divided the forest into smaller sections, systematically combing through the thick underbrush and dense woods. The helicopter circled overhead, scanning the landscape for any sign of movement or evidence. But the forest offered no answers. There was no sign of Mark or Emily. No faint tracks in the dirt, no broken branches or overturned leaves, nothing to suggest they had wandered off the trail. The searchers moved with caution, fearing they might miss the slightest hint that could lead them to the missing hikers. But despite their diligence, nothing came up. Days passed with little to show for the efforts. The ground, once rich with the promise of fresh clues, was now barren of any trace. The weather began to worsen as rain set in, making the search even more challenging. Any footprints or markings that had been left behind were quickly washed away, leaving nothing but the same empty landscape that had swallowed the couple whole. The team pushed forward, but the heavy silence of the forest seemed to mock their efforts, offering no answers, only more questions. As the days stretched on, the frustration within the search party grew. Each morning the volunteers gathered with hope, but as the hours wore on, they found themselves retreating without answers, empty-handed. For all their efforts they had found no leads. No signs of a struggle, no items left behind, and no indication of which direction Mark and Emily had gone. All that remained was their abandoned campsite, a haunting reminder of their sudden disappearance. It was the absence of clues that left everyone baffled. Normally, in cases of missing persons, there would be some trace of their whereabouts. Footprints, perhaps, or remnants of personal belongings scattered along the path. Maybe a torn piece of clothing, or some sign of distress. But there was none of that here. No frantic dash to escape, no desperate cries for help, no signs of any struggle. The campsite remained eerily undisturbed. The items inside the tent, Everything from their sleeping bags to their backpacks was left as if they had simply stepped out and were coming back in a moment. But they never did. The investigation spiraled deeper into confusion. As more time passed without any breakthroughs, it became clear that this wasn't just a missing person case. Something much darker and more puzzling was at play. The theory that Mark and Emily had simply gotten lost seemed increasingly unlikely, especially when the forest rangers pointed out how well prepared they had been. Mark, an experienced hiker, had a map, a compass, and the necessary survival equipment. Emily, though less experienced, had trusted Mark's judgment. They had set off with clear intentions and the right gear. Yet, despite all of that, they had simply vanished. The only thing anyone could agree on was that the disappearance made no sense. If they had been lost, surely they would have at least left some trace behind. If they had been attacked, there would have been signs of a struggle, maybe some blood, maybe broken branches or a disturbance in the underbrush. But nothing. It was as if the forest itself had swallowed them up. No trace, no leads, and no explanation. The frustration from the families was palpable. Mark and Emily's parents, desperate for answers, clung to the hope that the search would bring their children back. They had to believe that the forest would eventually give up its secrets, that someone, somewhere, would find something that would explain what had happened. But as the days turned into weeks, and still no new evidence emerged, hope began to fade. The search became a quiet routine. Teams would go out every day, scouring the area inch by inch, but they were met with the same emptiness each time. The forest, vast and mysterious, was simply too big, too full of secrets. They were looking for something they couldn't see, and it felt like the land itself was hiding the truth from them. What made the case even more bewildering was the fact that there was no rational explanation for the disappearance. Mark and Emily weren't involved in anything dangerous. There were no known enemies, no dark secrets, no reasons for them to vanish without a trace. They were just two young people who had decided to go for a weekend hike. They had no history of mental health issues or any signs that they might have intentionally disappeared. Yet, despite this, they were gone. As the weeks turned into months, the authorities were forced to wind down the search. The forest had offered up no clues, and despite hiring private investigators, the families were left without any answers. The case was marked as one of the many unsolved mysteries in the area. It wasn't long before the story began to fade from the headlines, and the case went cold. But for the families of Mark and Emily, the unanswered questions would haunt them for years to come. How could two young people simply vanish without a trace? What had happened to them? And why had the forest kept its secrets so tightly locked away? These were the questions that no one could answer. The search had ended, but the mystery remained unsolved, and perhaps unsolvable. The lack of any evidence, the empty campsite, and the complete absence of the couple's whereabouts left a void that no one could fill. The case was a puzzle with missing pieces, and without any clear explanation, it was destined to remain one of the many chilling and unexplained disappearances that history had left behind. 5 years had passed since Mark and Emily vanished into the wilderness, and the case had slowly drifted into the shadows of unsolved mysteries. Their families, still haunted by the unanswered questions, held on to a fragile hope that one day the forest would reveal its secrets. For all the years of silence, no one had given up on finding an answer. But what would they find when the truth finally emerged from the depths of the forest? In the spring of 2001, an event of nature itself brought an unexpected twist to the case. The area had suffered a brutal winter, followed by an intense period of rain and rapid snowmelt. As the floodwaters receded, the landscape of the forest had shifted. What had once been a dense thicket of trees now revealed a new reality: fallen branches, exposed earth, and the remnants of the torrential flooding that had altered the terrain. Amidst this upheaval, 2 forest rangers were conducting routine checks in a remote part of the national park when they made the discovery that would shake the entire community. Driving through the forest on their ATVs, The two men, Dave and Carl, noticed something unusual ahead. It wasn't a fallen tree, nor a pile of debris left by the flood. It was a perfectly round clearing, about 10 meters in diameter, untouched by the flood's chaos. The grass was still green, untrampled, and unusually pristine for a place that had just endured such a violent weather event. It was almost as if the floodwaters had avoided this patch of land altogether. As they approached the clearing, they saw something that made their blood run cold. Lying in the middle of the clearing, almost symmetrically spaced apart, were two bodies. The Rangers quickly silenced their ATVs and moved forward with caution. The bodies were damp, their clothes clinging to their forms, but they were unmistakably Mark and Emily. The descriptions from the missing persons report matched perfectly the same clothing, the same look of youth and vitality, now faded under the effects of the passing years. But there was something eerily unsettling about the way the bodies were positioned. They were lying flat on their backs, at a precise distance from each other, their heads facing due north, and their bodies arranged almost perfectly parallel. The positioning was unnatural, too exact to be coincidental. It was as though they had been placed there deliberately, as though someone had set them down with the care of placing pieces on a chessboard. The Rangers felt a deep sense of dread wash over them as they examined the scene more closely. The first thing they noticed was the lack of blood. In a case where the bodies had been lying exposed to the elements for so long, one would expect to find at least some trace of blood or fluids, particularly from any injuries. But there was nothing. The ground beneath them was disturbingly clean. No pools of blood, no sign that any violence had been done. The bodies were not even decomposing in the way one might expect after 5 years. Instead, their skin had hardened and darkened, as if they had been preserved by some unnatural force. As the Rangers surveyed the bodies, they noticed that there were no visible signs of injury, no stab wounds, no gunshot marks, and no broken bones. It was as if the two had simply died, yet there were no external signs to indicate the cause. The bodies were intact, except for one glaring absence. There were no internal organs. Mark's chest and abdomen, Emily's as well, were completely empty, a chilling emptiness that defied explanation. The pathologist who later examined the bodies would find no cuts, no tears, no openings, nothing to suggest that someone had removed the organs. The skin remained intact. The sheer impossibility of this discovery was enough to make even the most seasoned investigators question their own senses. How could this be? How could a person be drained of all their internal organs without any external sign of trauma or intervention? It was as if something had taken place that was beyond human comprehension. As forensic experts examined the bodies further, the mystery only deepened. The initial post-mortem revealed that both Mark and Emily's bodies had been completely drained of blood. The vascular systems, from the arteries to the veins, were entirely empty, without a single drop of blood left behind. There were no puncture wounds or signs of any surgical procedure. Their bodies, though cold and exposed to the elements, showed no signs of the usual decomposition process, which typically leaves behind fluids and stains on the ground. In fact, the entire scene seemed almost too perfect, too pristine, as if nature itself had been manipulated. What followed was even more baffling. The bodies were transported to the morgue, where Dr. Alan Carter, a highly experienced pathologist, began his autopsy. What he found defied every medical principle he had ever learned. When he made the incision to examine Mark's internal cavity, he froze. There were no organs inside. Nothing. The lungs, the heart, the liver, kidneys, intestines, each of these vital organs had been removed with surgical precision. But the skin remained intact, and there were no visible incisions. The abdomen was a hollow shell, completely empty. Emily's body revealed the same horrifying discovery. Dr. Carter's confusion and disbelief grew as he examined the bodies. Even after years of working in forensics, he had never encountered anything like this. The bodies were intact, with no visible marks, yet their internal systems were gone. It seemed like something out of a science fiction novel, not a real-life investigation. As word spread, the case became a subject of local horror stories. But the truth was more chilling than anyone could have imagined. As the investigation continued, the shocking absence of blood and organs became the focal point of the case. How could this happen? Who or what could have removed all the organs without leaving a trace? And why? The mystery deepened further, with no answers in sight, but the discovery of the bodies had catapulted the case into a new, horrifying realm of uncertainty. What had really happened to Mark and Emily? The questions multiplied, but the answers remained elusive, wrapped in a veil of darkness that seemed almost too impossible to uncover. As the investigation into Mark and Emily's mysterious deaths progressed, new evidence began to surface, evidence that would push the boundaries of conventional understanding. The discovery of the bodies had already shaken the investigators, but it was what came next that truly defied all logic and reason. After the bodies were examined, the forensic team carefully collected and cataloged every piece of evidence, no matter how small. One of the most critical findings occurred when the police were processing the clothing that had been found on Mark and Emily's bodies. In particular, there was a peculiar detail that had initially gone unnoticed, a faint, almost imperceptible trace on Emily's t-shirt, the one that had been used to cover her face. This item had been subjected to 5 years of harsh weather conditions, and any hope of finding usable evidence seemed slim. Yet, with painstaking care, the forensic team subjected the fabric to a series of tests in an attempt to recover any trace of information. What they found was something unexpected. Despite the years of exposure, and despite the floodwaters that had washed over the site, a faint, nearly invisible set of fingerprints emerged on the fabric. At first glance, they appeared to be smudged, incomplete, and unrecognizable, but after extensive enhancement using advanced forensic techniques, the investigators were able to discern a partial print, a fingerprint unlike any they had ever encountered before. The shape of the print was unsettling. The ridges on the fingerprint didn't match any known human print. They extended smoothly, uninterrupted, all the way from the... With no match, the investigation took a strange turn. How could there be a fingerprint that didn't belong to any known person? What did it mean? It was as though the case had shifted from a tragic human mystery into something far more complex and incomprehensible. Theories abounded, but none seemed to fully explain the anomaly. Some speculated that perhaps it was a case of a rare genetic mutation, or that Mark and Emily had encountered a previously unknown species, one whose physiology didn't conform to human standards. Others whispered about darker, more fantastical possibilities, things beyond the realm of human understanding. The most disturbing part of the discovery wasn't just the fingerprint itself, but the implications it carried. If the fingerprint belonged to something or someone who wasn't human, then what did that say about the deaths of Mark and Emily? Had they fallen victim to something far more sinister than a mundane criminal act? Were they the victims of some malevolent force, something not of this world? With this chilling evidence, the case took on an entirely new dimension. The investigators tried to follow every lead, but the deeper they dug, the more they found themselves trapped in a web of contradictions and impossibilities. The fingerprint couldn't be explained away as a mistake or a fluke. It was real, and it pointed to something that no one could identify. Was it possible that a being, not human, had been involved in Mark and Emily's deaths? Or was there something more to the mystery that no one could yet comprehend? The case quickly became a source of heated debate. Investigators were split. Some wanted to pursue a more traditional line of inquiry, focusing on possible human perpetrators, while others were reluctant to dismiss the unsettling nature of the discovery. The public, too, became captivated by the mystery, with some speculating on the supernatural elements at play. Could this be the work of something otherworldly, or was it simply an error in the forensic process? Months passed, and the investigation seemed to stall. New theories were proposed, old ones discarded, but nothing could explain the presence of the fingerprint or the strange, unexplainable nature of Mark and Emily's deaths. The bodies had been found, but the true cause of their deaths remained a question mark, as did the identity of their killer, if indeed there was a killer at all. Despite exhaustive efforts by the authorities, the case remained unsolved, its mystery growing deeper by the day. The strange fingerprint remained the key to understanding what had really happened, but it was a key that no one could fully turn. The case was eventually closed, but not in the way the families or the authorities had hoped. It was filed away under the unsolved cases, an open wound with no closure, a story left unfinished. Mark and Emily's families were left with more questions than answers, and no matter how many times the case was reopened, the truth remained elusive. What had happened to Mark and Emily? Who or what was responsible for their deaths? And why had they been left in that strange, perfectly arranged position in the forest, with no blood, no organs, and a fingerprint that didn't belong to any human being? The story of Mark and Emily's disappearance remained a dark and unresolved chapter in the annals of true crime, a case that would forever haunt those who had come so close to the truth, yet never quite grasped it. The forest, it seemed, had held its secret well, and the answers would never be fully revealed. As the years passed, the mystery of Mark and Emily's disappearance remained unsolved, the questions lingering in the air like an unsettling fog. Theories had been proposed, evidence uncovered, and even the most bizarre of clues had been examined, but the truth continued to slip through the fingers of the investigators. The case, once filled with hope, gradually turned into one of the many unsolved mysteries that seem to haunt the darker corners of the world. The fingerprint, so strange and unlike anything seen before, only added to the chilling uncertainty that hung over the investigation. Who or what was responsible for the horrific deaths of these two young people? Was it the work of a human, or something beyond the realm of understanding? Despite all the efforts to find answers, the truth remained just out of reach. The final, unanswered question remains: why? Why were Mark and Emily left in the woods, drained of their blood, stripped of their organs, and placed so carefully in a perfect, eerie alignment? It is a mystery that refuses to yield, leaving only a cold, unsettling silence. The forest itself, with its thick, impenetrable trees and secrets buried deep within the earth, becomes the final enigma. It is not just a backdrop to the events, but the keeper of the truth, holding its secrets tightly, never to be revealed. The very nature of the forest untouched, vast, and ancient mirrors the mystery that continues to haunt those who seek answers. In the end, it is the forest that remains the true secret, its silence the only resolution to a case that can never truly be solved. And so, the story of Mark and Emily, and the eerie mystery of their deaths, remains unfinished, a dark legend told only in whispers, left for us to ponder in the quiet, hidden spaces of our minds.